welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Anastasia Lavrina. From the crossroads of East and West, regions like Turkey, the South Caucasus and Central Asia are playing pivotal roles in shaping the future of geopolitics, economics and culture. As these regions evolve, their interactions with major global powers have never been more significant. But the global stage is expanding beyond traditional power centers. Africa, long underestimated, is increasingly asserting itself with growing influence across trade and development. On February 12, during official visit of Somali President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud to Baku, Azerbaijan and Somalia have signed multiple agreements marking a new chapter in their bilateral relations, covering economic, educational and security cooperation. In Africa, China has invested heavily in infrastructure and trade, becoming a key player in the continent's development. At the same time, Azerbaijan, positioned at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, has cultivated stronger ties with both China and African nations. Together, these growing relationships reflect the evolving economic and political influence of non-Western powers, highlighting new alliances shaping the future of global politics. More on this right now. Joining me from the United States is Glenn Howard, President and Chairman, Saratoga Foundation. And from France with us, we have Ronald Cato, journalist and African affairs expert. Warm welcome to Inside Politics. Let me start with a question. Thank you so much. So, Mr. Cato, let me start our conversation with you. Africa's growing influence is being recognized globally. What are the key drivers behind Africa's growing influence on the global stage, and how can countries in Africa continue to shape international politics?
Thank you. So I think Africa wasn't exactly getting the attention it deserved until China began paying attention. And we're talking about the early 2000s, the beginning of the so-called Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. So until China started the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation and followed that up very quickly with the Belt and Road Initiative, which began in 2013, which does not focus on Africa alone, but also on Europe and Asia and the Americas. I think at that point, the West began paying attention, because it is at that point, in my view, that Africa's profile began to rise. Before the early 2000s, the narrative about Africa, especially in the West, was such that the continent has failed. The continent is failing because then we had just come out of lots of civil wars, but also the problems to do with debt. And the West had just, come through of debt relief measures for many African countries. And the continent never held up until China began, sending its people and companies to invest here, to look for opportunities. But I think beyond China's involvement in Africa, the climate change and the so-called transition to clean energy has also raised the profile of Africa, especially in the West. Africa's strategic minerals, such as cobalt and copper, being central to the transition to cleaner energy, has got the West paying attention and wanting to compete with China. They are really looking at African countries with keener interest than we've done before.
Mr. Howard, indeed, China's growing influence in Africa has raised both opportunities and concerns. How do you perceive the long-term impact of China's investments on Africa's local industries, particularly in Somalia and other East African nations?
Well, China's been way ahead of the rest of the world in Africa. And you now have countries like France that are leaving Africa. You have countries like Niger and Mali that are distancing their relations with the former colonial power of France. And so now you have other powers moving into the region. You have the Russians moving in. And so there's been, throughout the history of Africa, they called it the Great Scramble for Africa by the colonial powers in Europe. And now, as China has moved into the Africa to search for strategic minerals and trade relations, building railroads and other things, that now you have other countries that are quickly trying to follow in those footsteps. And you have countries like Turkey that have developed a very strong presence in Africa. And for example, if you look at Somalia, where Turkey has developed very strong strategic relations, you can now see the President Aliyev's agreement and that he signed today in hosting the president of Somalia, is that they're basically, Azerbaijan is following in the footsteps of Turkey into the Horn of Africa. And it's going to move and develop relations with this part of the world to establish greater connectivity. And so the connectivity issue is something that Azerbaijan has always tried to do, and trying to build railroads, strategic corridors through Iran, through the Caucasus, the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. For Azerbaijan, it's always been about connectivity. So now you have other countries in the region, and like Turkey, moving into the Horn of Africa, and Azerbaijan is following in the footsteps of Turkey. But you also have countries like Ukraine and Russia fighting for the grain markets inside of Africa. So they're also establishing a presence and also a rivalry in Africa. And you see that rivalry extending between Ukraine and Russia in places like Sudan, for example. And so you're also seeing Turkey establish strategic relations with Libya, and also trying to counter Russian influence. So the region is undergoing a great transition right now, and it's very understandable why Azerbaijan is trying to develop and move into the region and developing stronger relations. Azerbaijan now has over $1 million in trade with Somalia. About 3 years ago, it was only around $20,000, which is very, very minimal, but it's rapidly rising. So Turkey is establishing a naval base, offshore drilling projects in Somalia. So it's natural for Azerbaijan to follow in that role to try to build stronger relations with Africa.
Mr. Kato, with France losing its position in some African countries, do you believe that Africa is at a crossroads when it comes to aligning with China or diversifying its international partnerships?
I think it remains to be seen. Countries, those African countries that are kicking out France to establish security partnerships with. I think China has been shy to involve itself prominently as a security partner, as a security provider. It hasn't exactly acted like countries such as Russia, for example, countries such as France, countries like the USA, which has bases in almost every African country. I think China's security involvement has mostly stopped at things such as security and policing conferences in Beijing. There's been a lot of talk, especially at summits, about increasing security contacts and exchanges between China and Africa, but these have mostly stopped at the level of Navy chiefs meeting in Beijing, police chiefs meeting in Beijing, a few servicemen from African countries going to train at defense universities in China. I don't see China. There's been talk about China establishing a naval base on the Atlantic. A lot of talk has pointed to Equatorial Guinea and Gabon, but those have not come to fruition. So I don't think we're about to see China getting involved, more prominently as a security partner, as a security provider. I think this is something that Beijing does not want to see, probably wants to do, but wants to see the sort of reception countries such as Russia, which is heavily involved in African security now, countries such as Turkey, now there's Azerbaijan. I think China wants to wait and see what sort of reception they will be getting 10 years down the road before they increase their security investment and engagement in Africa. I think for now we can conclude that they think that their naval base in Djibouti is in their interests well, and they want to steer clear of engaging more heavily and prominently in the African security architecture.
Right. You both already touched Azerbaijan and the visit of the president of Somalia to Azerbaijan today on February 12th. So, Mr. Howard, a strategic agreement was signed between the ministries of defense of Azerbaijan and Somalia, highlighting security cooperation and the development of defense industrial ties. What are the potential benefits of this cooperation for two sides?
Well, I think that Azerbaijan is just in the early stages of trying to develop a growing relationship with Somalia. So they're not in the position to be a provider of security to Somalia, not in the way that Turkey is. And Turkey has been very active with providing and training of Somalis inside Turkey in its military academies, in its police force. It's actively involved in counterterrorism cooperation. And has a very large embassy in Mogadishu. So they're very, very active. And Azerbaijan is simply trying to follow in the footsteps of Turkey and trying to expand its relations, it appears to me. They don't have real strategic interest, but certainly I could envision companies like SOCAR going into Somalia and working with the Somalis and bringing Somalis to Azerbaijan to train as technicians in the oil industry. Because it's very apparent that Turkey is going to develop the offshore oil and gas reserves of Somalia and perhaps also establish a naval base. And also, this will be a very strong foothold in Somalia. Now, Turkey doesn't have a colonial past in Africa in the way that France or the United States or even Russia do. So it will have a different presence in Africa than other countries. And so Azerbaijan will also bring a lot of things to the table to help Somalia in expanding its relations. And also because of the strategic relationship between Israel and Azerbaijan, it will certainly help with connectivity between Azerbaijan, the Horn of Africa, and the Caspian and the Caucasus. And the grain corridors that come from Ukraine through the Black Sea are very integral to that. So I wouldn't be surprised if you start seeing Ukrainian grain shipments to Somalia and helping to feed the Somali people. So that is another example of how the connectivity between the Caucasus, Caspian region, Black Sea, and Horn of Africa figure into the geopolitics, the changing geopolitics of Africa.
Indeed, very interesting answer. Mr. Kato, we do know about the strategic geolocation of Azerbaijan in the region of the South Caucasus, and you previously mentioned One Belt, One Road. Therefore, some experts are now already can predict the future importance of African continent, the South Caucasus, for the development of new transport links and energy cooperation. As previously was mentioned, Azerbaijani companies probably will be interested to work in energy sphere in Somalia, for example, promoting the green energy agenda. And Africa's relationship with Azerbaijan is often overlooked in mainstream discourse. What do you think are the most underestimated aspects of this partnership, and why should the world pay more attention to it?
I think that Baku is ambitious when it comes to wanting to establish ties, stronger relations with Africa of all the countries of the South Caucasus. And I remember being in Shusha last July, and lots of questions came to President Aliyev about what he wants to do with Africa and why he has more. And his response was, we are getting there. We are starting to talk to many African countries, and indeed, this year we have seen several high-level visits of Azeri officials coming to Africa. I think Azerbaijan has a lot to offer in terms of cooperation with Africa. It's an energy giant. Now, since it hosted the climate summit last November, its profile as an energy provider and as in clean energy in the South Caucasus grew, especially among African countries that are really eager to develop their own clean energy potentials. So I think there's a lot to benefit African countries when it comes to cooperation with Azerbaijan. Energy aside, I think also as a destination, the national airline of Azerbaijan is not yet operating any flights to African destinations. I think when it finally does, it will open up a whole range of opportunities for African countries that I would say many haven't really discovered Baku and the potential that it really has as a development partner, as an energy partner, and as a security partner.
Right, Mr. Howard, and my last question to you. United States, Russia, and China, given the diverse and often conflicting interests of global powers in regions like the African countries, how do you foresee these tensions evolving in the next decade?
Well, I certainly see that under President Trump, that the United States is certainly going to be more active in trade relations with countries and will try to reduce its military presence in many parts of the world while focusing on China. So there will be this kind of recalibration of American power that will have an impact that may last decades, and we don't know, but these changes are very, very strong and immense. Trade friction with the European Union, trade friction with Canada, trade friction with Mexico over the tariffs. So we're at a really changing fundamental point right now in American foreign policy. And so obviously they want to compete with China and other parts of the world, but it may be more in the area of economics and less so diminishing the reduction of American military influence. We just don't know. It's too early to say, but my point is that the changes that are occurring inside the United States today with the Trump administration will have long-lasting effect on the American military presence and activities in many parts of the world, including Europe, Africa, and also in East Asia, but with more of a focus on East Asia. But my own feeling is that the importance of countries like Azerbaijan and the Caucasus and Turkey will become more important as trade partners to the United States, as the United States becomes less ideological in terms of how it views its relations with countries like Turkey, Azerbaijan, and even Russia. It's basically going to be all about trade. So I don't know how that will affect the long-term impact on Africa, but it should be in a very positive way.
Dear experts, thank you so much for joining our discussion today. With us, we had from the United States of America is Glenn Howard, President and Chairman of Saratoga Foundation, and from France with us we had Ronald Cato, journalist and African affairs expert. Dear viewers, thank you for watching Inside Politics on A News. Do stay with us and see you in the next edition.